Hello everyone, so welcome to our first lecture on the origins of psychology, chapter 1. So the lecture is going to follow the outline of the chapter. So we're going to start by studying what psychology is and defining psychology. Then we'll move into the history of psychology and follow that up with contemporary psychology and finish with the goals of psychology. So why study psychology? Besides it being, a prerequisite for your major or fulfilling a general education, there's some valid reasons to, take the time to study psychology. First, we want to gain insights into why people behave as they do, why they think the way they think, why they feel the way they feel. And we also want to better understand our own thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and attitudes. We want to strengthen our appreciation of and tolerance for diversity. And then also, studying psychology helps us to evaluate the many so-called psychological facts we encounter every day in the popular media. So this is straight out of the textbook here, that psychology is defined as the scientific study of the behavior of humans and other animals. And of course, when we say behavior, we want to broaden that to include our thinking, which we refer to as cognition, as well as our emotions, our motivations, all things, beyond just the behavior. So next is psychology as a science, and we're going to go much, much more in depth with this in chapter 2 when we really dive into research methods. But the theories and the facts of psychology emerge from the careful application of scientific methods. And psychology is not just a matter of common sense, but instead we do very carefully designed studies to very often determine is common sense right or not. And then very few psychological principles are carved in stone. In physics and chemistry, they have all these laws, right, that work really well. In psychology, it's not such a clear-cut science. New theories as well as technological developments are constantly providing fresh directions and methods for expanding our knowledge. So at present, psychologists wish to study both behavioral processes, emotional processes, and mental processes. Let's move forward. So the study of humans and other animals. There are 5 major reasons for psychology to include the study of animals. Not all psychologists agree with, animal research, but many do. And so what are these 5 reasons? There could be the need to find a simpler model before moving to a more complex model. We'll see this when we dive into behaviorism. The research can provide greater control, and the more control an experimenter has over variables, the more precise the conclusions can be. Ethical considerations such that psychologists often ask questions that for ethical reasons cannot be addressed initially in research with humans. Animals are readily available for experimentation, often at minimal cost. And then psychologists study the behavior of animals simply to learn more about animal behavior. So like I said, this is a little bit controversial. Some psychologists say, how can we possibly look at animals to truly understand the human experience? However, as we start moving through the course, you'll see many, many different examples of where the research did include animals. Now, psychology really is a marriage between our philosophical roots and then empiricism, or the scientific method. So going back to antiquity, many philosophers debated things or, philosophized about things that we're still interested in researching today in psychology, such as the nature-nurture. And we now know in psychology, nothing is ever all nature, nothing is ever all nurture, but it's a dance between the two. Another thing would be the body and the mind. Is there something above and beyond what is in your biology that transcends it? What is consciousness? Can consciousness, be found in the brain? We haven't found where it is yet in the brain. And then also determinism versus free will. How much say do we have over our own behaviors, our own thoughts, our own emotions, and how much of it can be, manipulated and controlled by stimuli in the environment? And so these are things that started in philosophy that we are still actively researching today using that scientific method. Hence the whole idea of psychology being philosophy and empiricism combined. So Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychological laboratory at the University of Leipzig in 1879, and this marked the formal beginning of psychology as a scientific discipline. His work focused on breaking conscious mental processes into their basic elements and then analyzing how the elements were connected with one another. His work, again, he used something called introspection or looking inward, and he borrowed that from philosophy. And we're going to dive a little bit into introspection a little bit later into the class. Now, he had a student named Edward Tickner, and he brought his mentor's brand of psychology to America when he established a psychology laboratory at Cornell University in 1892. So you can see, in the realm of things, psychology is really a relatively young discipline. Tickner believed the proper goal of psychology was to describe mental structures, and he called this approach structuralism. So mental structures, structuralism. Structuralism was short-lived, and it was pointed out by critics that introspection often altered the nature of conscious mental processes that they wished to analyze. So just by thinking about it, you're changing the thinking, right? The school was also seen as impractical, and it didn't really offer solutions to the problems of everyday life. So moving from structuralism, we move into functionalism. And the man you see here is William James, and he is a giant in the field of psychology. He is regarded as one of the greatest American psychologists of all time, even today. And though he agreed with the structuralist on the study of mental processes, he felt that psychologists should understand the functional, continually changing personal nature of conscious experience. And so James's work was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and functionalists concluded that psychological states or processes such as consciousness evolved because they served a particular function, hence functionalism. And functionalists also introduced the study of animals as another research method. We're going to come back to William James when we do the chapter on consciousness, chapter 5. Just like this theory here, psychoanalysis, we will also be coming back to when we talk about consciousness, when we talk about personality, and when we discover or explore child development. So psychoanalysis is one that we will revisit 3 different times. But to kind of just give you the basis or foundation of it, Sigmund Freud is the name that should come to mind when you're thinking about psychodynamic theory and psychoanalysis, and we'll differentiate between those two in the future. And he emphasized sexual urges, the unconscious mind, and the talking cure or catharsis. And psychoanalysis has been criticized because its assertions cannot be tested in the laboratory. And when we talk about personality and we look at his components of personality, it'll become apparent of, oh, you can't actually test that in a laboratory. So why do we spend so much time bringing back Freud and looking at his theory? It's because even though it's not testable, and even though it hasn't, doesn't hold weight, it really did lay the foundation for where psychology has ended up. So after psychoanalysis and structuralism and functionalism, in 1913, a revolution against all of that was initiated by a man named John B. Watson here in America. And he called this behaviorism. And the goal of behaviorism was to identify the processes by which stimuli and responses become connected or associated. So in other words, how do we learn? And Watson's work was influenced by Ivan Pavlov and Edward Thorndike. And then another key behaviorist was B.F. Skinner, who proposed something called operant conditioning. We have an entire chapter, chapter 6, on behaviorism and learning theory and the different, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. So for now, just, say, okay, this is something that, again, we will be revisiting and seeing the history of it and where it has ended up today. All right, so we have 2 more slides on historical theories, then we'll move into where is psychology in contemporary times. Here is Gestalt psychology, and German psychologists Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler disagreed with the principles and methods used by both structuralism and behaviorism. You can see how they all are just always reacting to each other, right? And they argued that when sensory elements are brought together, something new is formed, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts is kind of the mantra of Gestalt psychology. So this something new is our perception of the stimulus. And this new approach to the investigation of perception was, again, called Gestalt psychology. So we will come back to this in the chapter on sensation and perception. But looking at this picture here, do you see 2 human faces where there's the nose and the mouth and the chin, the neck? Or do you see a vase right? So here would be the top of the vase going on down to the base sort of thing. So are you focused on the black portion or the white portion? And that just shows you how perception, it's a lot of fun. When we do the chapter, we're going to see how, perceptions can be manipulated. It's interesting, interesting, interesting. All right, and so the last historical theory we're going to talk about is humanistic psychology, which has actually been rebranded into what we would call positive psychology today. And humanistic psychology does not view human beings as being controlled either by events in the environment or by internal conscious forces. Instead, it emphasizes the role of free will and our ability to make conscious, rational decisions about how we live our lives. So it's your own volition that's in charge there. You're not being, a pinball being whacked around by things going on outside of yourself or within your unconscious mind. They believe people have a natural inclination to fulfill their human potential, a process called self-actualization. And humanistic psychology was criticized for its reliance on a non-scientific approach to understanding human behavior, to which they assert human behavior is not a subject to be investigated scientifically. So, earlier on in this presentation, we talked about how psychology is defined by using science. In the humanistic school of thought, they did not emphasize using the scientific method. Here are two of the giants in the field, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and we will visit them again in the chapter on personality as well as the chapter on motivation. All right, so contemporary psychology, where are we today? Modern psychology is not dominated by any single theoretical orientation. So if you were coming to this class like, I am finally going to understand why humans are the way they are, not so much. You're going to get some different perspectives on it, some different theories on it, but there's no solid, laws like I mentioned they have in physics. So there are many specialties within the field of psychology, and each emphasizes one of the theoretical approaches that you just saw from the historical perspective. And I know this is a horribly wordy slide, and it comes directly from your textbook, but you can just see some of the different fields of specialization in psychology. There's cognitive psychology, where it's really looking at thinking and memory, language, problem solving, creativity. Developmental psychology looks at, how do you become the person you become? What are the forces that are shaping that human development? Why do you have some children who grow up to be saints, and missionaries, and others that grow up to be serial killers? What are these factors that shape human development? There's social psychology, which is concerned with understanding the impact of environments on the individual. Personality psychology, looking at the uniqueness of individuals and what goes into the foundation of personality. At what age is personality set, or does it continue to evolve across the lifespan? Experimental psychology is really focused upon research and laboratory settings. Biological psychology studies the relationship between physiological processes and behaviors, the effects of drugs on behavior. Clinical psychology is looking at treating behavioral problems or mental disorders. Counseling psychology, they're going to be helping people with less serious problems, maybe adjustment, bereavement. Educational psychology involves the study and the application of learning and teaching methods. School psychology is looking at evaluating students' abilities and interests. So you kind of want to take a moment there to differentiate between educational psychology and school psychology. Industrial organizational psychology is making the workplace a more satisfying place to allow for, the best employees that there could be, such as what's a good temperature, what is the proper lighting, those sorts of things. Sports psychology is looking at applying psychological principles to enhance sport performance. Then health psychology is looking at the interaction between behavioral factors and physical health. If you have ever been in the hospital as a child, they have a child life specialist to try to make sure that that child is doing the best that they can while being in a very uncomfortable place for them if they're sick. And so that would be, an application of health psychology. I already mentioned how humanistic psychology has kind of evolved into positive psychology. So again, being self-fulfillment, happiness, forgiveness, all those things, mindfulness, all of that would be part of positive psychology. Forensic psychology is the intersection of the law with psychology. So you'll see things such as profiling, supporting police officers in their mental health, making sure prison conditions are optimal for those in prison, all of those, trying to make decisions or mediation about divorce and where kids should be. All of that falls within the umbrella of forensic psychology. Artificial intelligence, this is kind of a newer one. It's focusing on the development of computer models to simulate human cognitive processes and to solve problems. And then connectionism focuses on the development of computer hardware that simulates the kind of parallel connections among neurons in the brain. So the two of those are much newer in terms of specializations in psychology. Evolutionary psychology. There's two parts of evolution. You've got macroevolution, such as the Big Bang Theory, and you've got microevolution, which we're focused much more on the microevolution of how do humans adapt for whatever situation that they're in. Another thing that could fall under evolutionary psychology would be pheromones. What role do pheromones play in selecting a mate? And so those are kind of just a couple of examples of evolutionary psychology. And then there's cultural psychology or cross-cultural psychology, where it's investigating how culture and religious traditions and practices shape and contribute to differences in human behavior. So we're a very independent sort of culture where we take pride in our work and things such as that, as opposed to, say, a collectivistic culture where it's more about the family and, making sure everyone's together sort of thing. And that's just one example of something that would be studied in terms of cultural psychology. So you can tell from the previous slide that there's a lot of different career paths in psychology beyond just clinical or counseling psychology. For example, as I mentioned, you've got child life specialists that work with children in the healthcare industry. You have the school psychologist. You have those that work on commercials in convincing people to buy things that they don't need, sort of thing. So they work in advertising and marketing. You've got that sports psychology where every major sports team has at least one psychologist on staff. So there's a wide variety of different career paths in psychology. What I want to draw your attention to on this slide is information regarding the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science. You can Google both of these and find their websites. Both of them have, news stories for everyday people to read about breaking news in psychology based on research. And they both also have organizations that students can join and help network sort of thing. So if you're thinking of going into psychology, looking at going into graduate school, you may want to go ahead and look at joining and having a student membership with either the American Psychological Association and or the Association for Psychological Science. And so that then leads us to our last slide, which is the goals of psychology. So all psychologists share a common goal for psychology for understanding why people do the things that they do, feel the way they feel, think the way they think. Being able to predict is important, right? And then explaining human behavior. Why is it this way? So all psychologists agree on those three. The last one, controlling or influencing behavior, is a bit more controversial because do you really want to control another person's human being? Does that step on their free will or their own volition? So a humanistic psychologist would never say, oh, I want to control someone's behavior sort of thing. But for other areas, they very much so believe that a goal of psychology should be influencing behavior. So then let's just go a little bit really quick, kind of give an insight into where we're going to be going next time. A good psychological theory generates a hypothesis, which can then be subjected to empirical testing. If it's not testable, then it's not a good theory, okay? And that's why things like psychodynamic theory has fallen to the wayside. Hindsight bias allows us to explain a variety of behavioral phenomena, but it's only right occasionally. So when we're looking at research, especially when we're talking about research in the field of human growth and development, you don't want to take a person who's ended, 20 years old, let's go back and see how you became the person you are today. We like to instead do prospective studies, start studying them from the cradle and see how things progress sort of thing because of that hindsight bias. And then the experimental testing of hypotheses has refuted many common assumptions about human behavior. So things that, we're like, oh, of course it's this way. It's like, oh, not so much sort of thing. And again, I'll give you more specific examples of that as we go. But that is our introduction to psychology.